A stern warning from the British government to Scotland ahead of a referendum on independence. London says an independent Scotland will lose the pound, jobs and business. Can Scotland be a viable state on its own? And what would it mean for the UK as a whole? This is Inside Story. And welcome to Inside Story. I'm Shihab Rattansi. No union, no pound. That's the message from the British government, warning Scots that if they walk away from the United Kingdom, they'll be walking away from sterling too. Scotland will vote on independence in September, and the comments made by the British Chancellor have intensified a debate that could lead to the end of the 307-year-old union. Lawrence Lee has this report.
So it seems the debate over the future of Scotland might have come down to this: the pound, or more specifically, what currency an independent Scotland might or might not be able to rely on. In a coordinated attack in London, all three major political parties put up their key financial spokesman to say that an independent Scotland would not, as it wants, be able to join a currency union with the rest of the UK.
I could not, as Chancellor, recommend that we could share the pound with an independent Scotland. The evidence shows it wouldn't work. If Scotland walks away from the UK, it walks away from the pound.
The argument runs like this, that currency unions only work if different countries have similar economies and can therefore set interest rates which suit them all. The argument in London is that the experience of the Eurozone proves that this doesn't work. If Scotland goes its own way, the rest of the UK shouldn't have to prop it up. This then in many ways the most significant intervention to date by the entire political class in Westminster on the Scottish question. Not so much an appeal to the Scots to stay within the Union, but a direct threat as to what might happen to them if they decided to break away. Bear in mind too the very large number of undecided Scottish voters. This then an attempt too, it appears, to make people's minds up for them. So would a currency union end up with Scots begging on the streets of Glasgow like Greeks have had to in Athens? The Scottish nationalists are, well, unimpressed with the idea that they're like Greece and the UK is like Germany.
The reason Greece failed in the euro, for example, had nothing to do with the fact they shared a currency. It had everything to do with the fact that productivity was barely a third of that of Germany's. Scotland's productivity and that of the UK is near identical. This has been described as many people as an optimal currency area.
The line from the Scottish nationalists remains that even if you discount North Sea oil, Scotland's economy is big enough to stand up by itself and would be no impediment to the rest of the UK. But as a fear tactic, questioning exactly what Scotland would do for a currency in the years to come has to be a powerful weapon. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, Scotland's First Minister Alex Salmond expressed his anger at the threat, saying, quote, "This is a concerted bid by a Tory-led Westminster establishment to bully and intimidate, but their efforts to claim ownership of sterling will backfire spectacularly." He adds, the stance of any UK government will be very different the day after a yes vote to the campaign rhetoric we're hearing now. There are some strong arguments for and against Scottish independence. Some Scots argue the union doesn't recognise their unique needs and aspirations, which are always of secondary importance to politicians in Westminster. Independence would give Scotland more political freedom and perhaps lead to a reform of its tax and benefit system. And it would give Scots real political representation. The Conservatives, now leading the British government, are a party the Scots have rejected for years. But there could also be downsides. The UK, it's argued, gives Scotland financial security. Some say it would face greater risk alone. And though much has been made of North Sea oil revenues, Scotland could face a net loss if it loses its UK income. And some argue the UK is a successful union, not just economically, but politically too. An independent Scotland could have less of a global presence and less influence abroad. Well, let's talk more about the consequences of Scotland's independence. Joining me to discuss this are our guests. In Edinburgh, Jim Gallagher. He's a fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. He's a co-author of Scotland's Choices, the referendum and what happens afterwards. and has been drafted in by the No campaign to explain how devolution was already evolving. In London, Angus Armstrong, fellow at the Economic and Social Research Council, and joining us via Skype from Dundee is Allan Grogan, the head of Labour for Independence, a group of pro-independence supporters of the Labour Party. Professor Gallagher, first of all then, so this is the tactic now, blackmail. If you win, we'll do our best to destabilise you. Is that the basis of a stable union?
What you're seeing here is the UK government and indeed the UK parties and people on the no side of the campaign, the Better Together side, explaining how the economics influences the debate, trumping, in our view, the rather short-term politics that the Yes campaign are running. What the Yes campaign are doing is saying to the Scottish people, you can vote for independence, and nothing very much will change. You'll be able to keep all the bits of the UK that you like, but those bits that you don't much like, well, we'll fix those for you. And what this is saying is that independence is a big change, and in particular, it's a big change in economic terms, because it wouldn't involve a stable currency union with the rest of the UK.
Allan Grogan, we'll examine that argument in a moment, but politically, I suppose you're hoping, and Alex Salmond is hoping, this is all going to backfire, that this is exactly the type of strong-arming that might tip undecideds to yes.
Absolutely. You know, it's a clear political game in which usual scare stories and fearmongering by the No campaign is taking place again. Former First Minister Henry McLeish, who is himself a No voter, said it was entirely political and it was all about fear and scare stories. But I think what's important to define here is that you mentioned the Yes campaign and nothing's going to change, but that's actually SNP policy, the white paper. There's many different organisations and political parties within the Yes campaign. And we also have different visions of what an independent Scotland could be like.
Professor Angus Armstrong, and what about the arguments that we've been hearing? This unionist argument, though, that simply it's not viable for Scotland to leave the union but retain sterling.
I'm completely neutral and independent on this issue. In terms of the discussion over sterling, I think it's very important to be absolutely clear what is at stake here. So the idea that is Scotland entitled as an independent country to its share of the notes and coins of sterling, the answer to that question is yes. And I'm quite sure that the rest of the UK will be willing to give them 8 to 10%, whichever the number comes out to be, 8.5% actually is the right number, of the existing notes and coins. But that is not what the Scottish government proposed in its white paper. It proposed a formal monetary union which involves sharing the Bank of England, which is an institution backed by the taxpayers of what would be a foreign country, i.e. the taxpayers in Westminster. And clearly it would be up for those taxpayers in Westminster to decide whether they want to go through with that agreement or not. It's as simple as that. And what we saw yesterday was 3 representatives saying, in their view, they are not prepared to go forward with that proposal.
Alex Grogan, then, it's up to London, it's up to English democracy to decide whether Scotland should be able to continue to use sterling.
Well,
no,
to clarify something that Danny Alexander said yesterday when he said if you vote yes, then you won't get to keep the pound. It's absolutely correct that Scotland could, of course, keep the pound because the pound is a tradable currency. However, Scotland and the Bank of England is an asset. And it's one of the assets which would be up for negotiation if and when we vote yes in the referendum. Now, it's very important to state that Scotland makes a decision and we decide how we're going to have our currency. Of course, the English will have a debate on this, but I think it would be incredibly folly of any Westminster government to go against a currency union which would benefit both Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. You know, you're talking about £600 million in transferring currencies over from businesses into Scotland. That's a huge tax on businesses in the rest of the UK, and it's something that I don't think people in the rest of the UK would stand for.
And we'll look into the various options facing Scotland if it does vote yes in a moment. But very quickly, Professor Armstrong, though, there has always been this idea that Alex Salmond of the SNP hasn't presented a plan B because his argument is, well, when we vote yes, they'll simply have to deal with it. Do you think that argument still holds? Do you think that the Tories and indeed the other parties in the UK are in fact bluffing?
No, I think the critical question here is what is actually in the interests of the rest of the UK? And people are very willing to say what they think the interests are, but the UK government And in fact, our own research has looked at how a currency union would work. And we think that it'd be so difficult to put enough constraints on what would be an independent sovereign country that it'd be very difficult to see how this would work. And so the idea that it's a bluff, does that outcome, does that analysis change the day after a yes vote? No, it doesn't. What would happen if the independent Scotland started perhaps weakening, and would this be able to be used as some sort of a negotiating ploy? Well, perhaps the right answer there would be a fiscal transfer rather than unpacking something which the UK government, and actually independently but ourselves, don't think makes sense on either side of the border, oddly enough.
Right, but I mean, what about the effect on the English economy, Professor Armstrong, there? What about the huge transaction costs for English business, the effect on balance of payments and so on?
Scottish independence is extremely important for the rest of the United Kingdom. But just to stick to the economics, people say, but there's a lot of cross-border trade. There is indeed a lot of cross-border trade, but there's much more cross-border trade between the rest of the UK and Europe, for example. And only a decade ago, there was a discussion about whether the rest of the UK should tie its currency to the euro, and it declined that on very similar grounds. So, yes, it would cost businesses and citizens in the rest of the UK money, but we've seen them make this decision before. Furthermore, there's many countries in Europe which have not joined the euro, such as Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, and it's hard to argue they've been a great deal worse off because of it. And the final point is the oil revenues. It's true that the exports of oil and gas, which is currently UK export, would no longer be there. That's absolutely true. That's worth about 6% of total UK exports. It's a problem, perhaps a 1 or 2 year problem, but it's not an insurmountable problem. So I think, again, these issues of somehow it can't be afforded this position for the rest of the UK, I don't think the economics supports that.
Professor Gallagher, what about that point, though, that frankly London doesn't have the right to do this, to argue that the Bank of England is its own, it's part of its own remit, that this is part of all of the UK, and that includes Scotland, frankly?
Well, the Bank of England serves the whole of the UK while Scotland's in the UK. If Scotland chooses to leave the UK, it chooses to leave the UK's institutions, including the Bank of England. Think of it the other way around. Imagine that England, after a Scottish vote for independence, was to say to the Scots, you must use the pound. We require you to have the currency that we choose. Mr Salmond and his friends would reject that, and they would be right to do so. Well, what we're seeing here is the rest of the UK saying to a putatively independent Scotland, it's not up to you to decide whether we get forced to join in a currency union with you. And that must be right. And all this stuff about institutions and we own the pound is simply nonsense.
Allan Grogan?
Well, what Professor Gallagher just said there, he's talking about Scotland forcing the rest of the UK into a currency union. The rest of the UK forcing Scotland into a currency union. We're not forcing anybody. We're here to negotiate in the best way possible that benefits both the people of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom following independence. What I think is slightly odd is the fact that these currency exchanges and zones have happened many times before with the UK when other countries have left the British Empire. For example, Ireland's a perfect example, which continued to be in a sterling zone with the UK for many years after it had its own independence. I think this is just further scare stories and tactics, and I think we'll see a much different response from the UK government, whoever that may be, in 2015 when we negotiate. And I think that for the benefit of the rest of the UK and for the people of Scotland, which the rest of the UK, 71% in a recent poll, supported a currency union with Scotland. And I think that they will change their minds and they will see a much different perspective from them after 2014.
All right, well, let's look at the hypotheticals in case this isn't a bluff then, Allan Grogan. I mean, do you think for a start, though, Alex Salmond is going to have to offer some sort of plan B now?
Well, I mean, I think it's up to the SNP to decide how they're going to promote it. Again, I'd like to stress it's very important. It's not just the SNP and the Yes campaign. We would be willing to look at other options. I think it's prudent in the unlikely event that the Westminster government did not accept the currency union. I think it's prudent, and there are other options available for Scotland. And Scotland are, very wealthy country, and we can do very well for ourselves in whichever currency zone sphere we decide to take.
So there seem to be 4 different scenarios that are being mentioned. Professor Armstrong, one, that the SNP does a quiet deal with the Bank of England anyway and basically surrenders all fiscal and monetary policy in order to keep sterling. Does that look terribly likely? And what would that mean for any progressive agenda that the SNP is promising for an independent Scotland away from the increasingly rightward slant of English politics?
So this, if I've understood the option correctly, is commonly known as dollarization, or would be, in this case, in the vernacular, called sterlingization. That is where Scotland, independent Scotland, would use sterling but have no access to the monetary framework of the United Kingdom. That would strike me as a risky strategy. Why? First of all, because it would have no monetary policy, it would have no currency policy, and it would be a new country with a fairly high level of debt. And if anything were to go wrong, and I'm not saying anything would go wrong, but you know, every 10 years something does tend to happen, it would be very hard for a country without any other controls to avoid political pressures to leave the sterlingization. And that would lead to pressure on interest rates, which could lead to the sort of spirals we've seen in other countries. So I don't think that would either be a strategy that would be followed, or, in my view, a wise strategy.
Actually, I was suggesting an even more radical position, which is actually to have a negotiated dollarization. I guess what you're suggesting is a dollarization without any kind of informal or formal deals behind the scenes, perhaps. Another option then is a move towards the euro. But again, Allan Grogan, what confuses me about that is, again, what happens to the progressive agenda? Because once again, you would be surrendering your economic policy to an ECB who doesn't seem terribly concerned about progressive redistributive policies.
That's, as you said, one of 4 options that we have, and it's not something I think anybody within the Yes campaign has ever really looked at with any great merit. I think there is arguments to be made, as you say, that we would be surrendering to the wider European Union some of our sovereignty in regards to that. But there's other methods that we can take. You know, we can tag the Scottish pound to the UK, the rest of the UK sterling zone for a particular period of time in order to maintain some stability. What's important to remember is that this independence vote is not just an election that's going to be changed in 5 years. We can have 10, 15, 20 years of political economic stability by tagging with the rest of the UK in the pound for them as the Scottish pound. We tag that, and you know, then we can look at other options that's in the best interest of the people of Scotland.
Professor Armstrong, though, very quickly before I bring Professor Gallagher back in, what about a separate Scottish currency then? How viable might that be?
Alan's just raised a very good point. If a country wants to have independence, a country with the sort of wealth and population the size of Scotland, then, you know, look around the world and they do tend to have their own currency. Whether it's the Scandinavian countries or even Hong Kong has its own currency. They all tie them to different things and so on, but it is completely possible. And, you know, normally the thing about when a country introduces a new currency, it's the handover that's very difficult, because you have to stamp old notes and have new notes issued and so on, all very difficult. But here the bizarre thing is, actually Scotland's got its own currency already. All that we required is to set up the right institutions, enact the right laws, move up the reserves that are held at the Bank of England. I'm saying all. But, you know, certain things are already in place. There is a Scottish currency. And this solution, although I should emphasise that the transition has risks and would take quite a long time, that's the problem with it, but this solution delivers the most economic freedom, which is entirely consistent with an independent country. They could do their own interest rates, have their progressive agenda, use currency if occasionally it's necessary, tie it to sterling if they wish, go to the euro in the longer term. That's independence.
Professor Gallagher, Scotland does have options then?
Yes, it does. I think the important thing is that the option which the SNP chose to present to the Scottish people, which is that they could be independent and not independent at the same time by having a currency union, has now been ruled out. And what we need to know from Mr Salmond and his colleagues is which of those options would they pursue? Do they want to pursue the dollarization option, the option that Panama and Montenegro pursue? Do they want to go for the euro, or do they want to have their own currency? What they can't do is say that they want to have something which we now know they can't have.
And that is interesting, Allan Grogan. Is there a sense then that this might lead Alex Salmond to have a more radical position on independence instead of this indie light position? I mean, it did sound rather federalist rather than independent all along, really. I mean, do you think this might be shifting the argument even further towards independence, ironically?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for Alex Salmond, but you know, the Scottish Government will lead the negotiations following a yes vote in September this year, and they believe, and I actually accept this, for a shorter period to have a currency zone is the benefit for the rest of the UK and Scotland. What I think the Westminster parties, and as a Labour member, I'm very sad to see that my party would join forces with the Tory-led coalition in agreeing to this. What I think they will be surprised at is that Scottish people don't take very well to being bullied, and I think they're going to be in for a bit of a surprise come September if this is the kind of scare tactics they're going to continue with.
And we want to widen the debate out into the rest of the year, but very quickly on that point, Allan Grogan, do you think Labour is siding with the Tories on this because they know that they'll never get into power again, they'll never get Downing Street again?
Well, I mean, that's not actually true. I mean, I think it's only twice in the last 50 years that Scottish vote has altered the general elections in Westminster. What I would say is that I think Scottish independence would actually give new light to Northern England and allow them to perhaps becoming more federalised, because I think that's very important. I think a lot of people in England, as well as Scotland, are sick and tired of the monetary and fiscal policies always aimed at London-based, and I think Scotland would then have an economic area in Edinburgh which would help Northern England as well.
Well, let's take a look at what the impact of a successful vote for Scottish independence might have to other separatist movements in Europe very quickly in our last few minutes. Flemish nationalists in Belgium have given their support to the Scottish campaign. Independence-minded nationalists in Spain's Basque region have been making gains recently. Catalonians in the south of Spain have a strong movement in favour of independence from Madrid. Elsewhere in the EU, Italy's Northern League has pursued independence for Padania. Professor Armstrong, though, do you feel that a yes vote will have a major impact across Europe, then?
I think it would depend very much on the terms of the yes vote. So, for example, I think if there was a yes vote and Scotland was to introduce its own currency and to take its share of the debt, I think that Scotland would have every opportunity of joining the important multilateral institutions like the European Union, perhaps even NATO eventually. So I think Scotland would then be seen as a successful transition. If, however, there was some sense that Scotland was not going to take its share of the UK existing debt, then the sort of precedent this would set for these other countries, I think that would start making things very difficult. And so I think it really depends on the terms. This is getting away from, of course, the issue of currency union. So I think it depends on, to the extent that it's actually agreed in an amicable way with the rest of the UK is important. That goes to this currency issue. And honouring its obligations on the existing UK debt. If both of those are done, I think it would be seen as a beacon for some of these other regional issues. Can I also just pick up on Alan's point about other areas in the United Kingdom? I accept that point. I think that whatever the outcome of this referendum is, there are some constitutional issues in the UK to be considered about rebalancing power across the regions.
Very quickly, though, Professor Gallagher, this is all a bit unfair, though. It's an interesting point. We don't know what the British government's position is going to be on all these other issues. Are they going to amicably negotiate with Scotland, whether they're going to be pro them joining the EU, all these other issues? Now we have this selective release of information about sterling. Again, it's not really the greatest atmosphere for a vote.
I think what we do know is that the UK government will negotiate, and it will negotiate in good faith. What it's not going to do, and I understand why it's not going to do it, is set out its negotiating position in advance. But they have made an exception in the currency issue, and they made an exception in the currency issue because the SNP and the Scottish Government have simply said airily that don't worry, you're guaranteed a currency union, and the UK Government are saying that one's not on.
All right, Professor Jim Gallagher, thank you very much. Professor Angus Armstrong and Allan Grogan, thank you both as well. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Bye for now.